Hey everyone, welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you this week from just outside of Chicago, Illinois. In fact, my childhood home in Evanston, doing shows this week in the Midwest, in the Chicago area and in Cleveland, and then later on in the week, heading back to New York. This is episode 106 of Inside Israel, entitled JNF Global Conference Recap. And the whole idea here is to share some of the takeaways I have from being at the Jewish National Fund conference in Fort Lauderdale a couple of weeks ago. It was really incredible to be there, and I learned so much. I consider my knowledge of Israel pretty deep, but it's always great to be surrounded by experts and really smart people who come at things from a different point of view. And I just want to share a couple of those insights with you. Before we get to that, a little bit of front matter. First of all, a big welcome to our new listeners. I've been on the road for the past 4 weeks, and a lot of people signing up after my events and shows for the podcast, for the newsletter. And so we have a lot of first timers joining up. Thank you. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you on board, and you are part of what I really see as an Inside Israel community, not just a podcast. That's one way, but I love hearing from you. And it really is a community of people who have shared values, although we don't always agree on everything, but that's good. Second thing, I've been meeting a lot of you guys on tour, and that has been wonderful. I always say, hey, if you're going to be in one of these locations, come up and say hi. And you have been, and you've been sharing your words, not just about your attachments to Israel, but what this podcast is doing for you. I must say, it's really moving to hear how much the podcast is touching you in a personal way and impacting you and giving you a unique perspective that you're not seeing in other places. I know you get the headlines from myriad websites and television broadcasts, etc. But really, the role of this podcast is to give you, the inside look. What is the average Avi and Tali feeling going through right now? And I know you guys appreciate that. You guys are the core audience who supports and stands behind Israel, even if you sometimes struggle with everything happening there. Believe me, I do too. So it means a lot to me that I'm reaching you and making a little bit of impact. And I got to call out, Judy in the Boston area who actually brought me chocolate babka for my flight the next day and gave me a handwritten card as well about this topic. So, hey, Judy, thanks so much for taking the time to do that. Babka, always appreciated, but not required or expected. And lastly, before we hop into the main topic, I don't know how much you're following this, but there is a crazy ass scandal breaking in Israel right now. I will try to do this al regel achat, as they say, on one foot, as quickly and succinctly as I can. Basically, last summer, it came out that IDF reservists were severely abusing a specific prisoner who had been held in an Israeli jail. This was a prisoner taken from Gaza, suspected to have taken part in the October 7th attack, not necessarily proven. Sort of beside the point at the moment, video surfaced of this prisoner being abused by IDF reservists. And the legal side of the IDF, the top lawyer in the IDF, said that she was going to open up an investigation into the mistreatment of this prisoner. And so some right-wing politicians and right-wing people in general tried to storm the base and basically were protesting, saying, why should we care what IDF soldiers do to a Palestinian, a Gazan, who probably took part in the October 7th attacks? Why would you stand up for this Gazan over IDF soldiers? And it kind of led to a little bit of a disagreement in Israeli society about who do we prosecute? Where do we put our energies and our money? And so there was a leak. It turned out that this video of the prisoner being abused was leaked to the Israeli media, and the magistrate general, the head lawyer in the IDF, said that she would get to the bottom of the leak and find out who leaked this video of the prisoner being abused. Well, this past week, it came out that she was the one who leaked the video herself. Crazy. But it doesn't end there. Of course, she had to step down from her position, but then she disappeared. And it was suspected that she had maybe attempted suicide because she left a very cryptic note in her home, which she knew her family would find. She was ultimately discovered soaking wet on a beach in Israel after having supposedly attempted suicide by drowning herself. But now it's come out, as if that's not crazy enough, that the whole thing was a hoax and that she faked her suicide and that maybe even her husband helped her to fake this suicide as a way to detract attention from what she had done wrong by leaking the video. Absolutely nuts. And absolutely the last thing that Israel needs right now. But in any case, if you want to kind of follow the drama of what Israelis are talking about, this is a huge story. It goes back to the trustworthiness of our highest officers, to the idea of a deep state, the idea of anti-Netanyahu propaganda. The whole idea behind leaking the video was to show that there actually was abuse happening, something we needed to investigate, that the right wingers who were saying don't investigate these IDF soldiers for abusing, to prove that they were wrong because there was actual real abuse happening. And I think there's a case to be made for saying, hey, we need to not lower ourselves to our enemy's standards. We need to investigate crimes when they happen. But for the top lawyer in the IDF to leak a video, I think the real problem here was that she was completely out of touch with how much a video like this would reflect poorly on Israel around the world. She was very naive, thinking it would stay within Israel itself, or she was self-centered. The fact is, this video got out, it was publicized, it made Israel look terrible in world media. So here we are, Israel, the root of our own problems, the cause of our own problems in this scenario. But it's definitely a drama unfolding. And even when you listen to this, the story will have probably developed and changed between my recording it and the time it reaches your ears. But that is what Israelis are talking about right now. As for the main topic of this episode, giving you a little bit of insight into what I took away from the JNF Global Conference, the first thing I'll have to say of the 3 points is how wonderful it was to be there, to be surrounded by 2,000 people who care about Israel passionately. And that does not mean just applauding Israel no matter what. We have a lot of people at this conference who know that there are things that upset them about the government, who can acknowledge that Israel is not acting the way we always want the country to act. But that's part of loving Israel, living there, and supporting the country, is knowing that, hey, this is not Disneyland for Jews. It's not utopia. It's imperfect, and we're trying to make it better. But there was this baseline level of agreement, and to be surrounded by 2,000 plus people who all agree that October 7th was a massacre and that it was not deserved, which is not to be taken for granted. We're inundated with messages from the media that somehow Israel was in a way responsible for what happened on October 7th, that we brought it on ourselves due to past behavior, occupation, etc. To just get rid of all that junk and exist in this space where there was a baseline level of support, agreement, love for Israel, and belief in Israel. It was just so invigorating. And to be around people who wanted to have conversations about Israel, but where you didn't need to start at the beginning and explain that there was a war in 48, that where we were attacked, and another war in 56, etc., but some knowledge of the history and all of the basic facts taken for granted. It was just so wonderful to be there. And I got to point out, a lot of participants were young. I mean, by all means, I would say most participants were 55 plus, maybe even 60 plus, but there was a very large cohort who was 40 and under. And this instills us with a lot of hope as well. I do think in general, we need to do a better job of recruiting more what we'd call young adults into Jewish organizational leadership and participation. We have to think in new ways about what attracts them, what will keep them on, what will get them to donate and participate, but really just empowering to see young people there. And it certainly goes against the narrative that young people don't care about Israel at all. And college kids can be written off. One of the most compelling sessions was an interview with the journalist and author Douglas Murray. And he was interviewed on stage by a college student who carried herself like an experienced 40-year-old journalist. So I don't know her name, but kudos to her. It really does give hope that there is something there in the young generation that eventually the torch can be passed to them. So first takeaway was just how great it was to be there. And I got to say, from the logistical point of view, the conference was planned really, really well. I've been to enough of these Jewish conferences to see when they're great and when they're poor, when they're disorganized and all over the place. But that was not like this. This one was really organized well with enough time for breaks, but not too much time for breaks that people would just go to the room and take a nap. If there was one complaint, it's that there were too many great speakers who were facing off back to back at the same time. So people had to choose. I know I missed some sessions that I really wanted to go to because I myself was teaching at that same time. I was there to teach a couple sessions. I taught a session on purity of arms, Torah and Neshek, which is the IDF's code of ethics in battle. I taught Hebrew is Magic, a live session, which I do, and both of those went really well. And I did the comedy Saturday night. They had a big comedy show with a number of Jewish comedians, and I was one of them. So I was there as a participant because I would go to sessions when I wasn't teaching and performing, but I also did teach as well. So great time. I encourage you to attend conferences like these, if for no other reason, just to marinate yourselves in the energy of being around people who have a shared point of view toward Israel. So positive, and mazal tov, bemet kol hakavod to JNF for pulling it off. Number two, one topic, one session that I did attend addressed the question of why Europe is so in favor of a Palestinian state. And I've talked about this a little bit, but I heard some really amazing things in this session that I want to share with you and just sort of pass it on. So one point that there was a panel of speakers on this topic, and one point the panel made was that supporting a Palestinian state makes Europeans feel better about themselves. And I never thought about it this way on such simple terms, but that is definitely part of it. It's not just complex feelings about the Holocaust and sort of a Freudian need to take the opposite side and justify past actions. Sometimes it's just, it seems like the right thing to do. And when you look at the footage coming out of Gaza, destroyed buildings, killed children, dead women, like, let's be honest, supporting a Palestinian state can seem like the right thing to do. So sometimes the simplest answer is the correct one, or at least part of it. And that really got me thinking about this idea of just how simple it can be, that it just feels right for Europeans. And I think the reason it feels right is because they're very far removed from the conflict. They do not have Gaza next to them. It's easy to want a Palestinian state when it's not next to your own country. Would they be willing to turn part of Wales into a Palestinian state? Highly doubtful. But just the fact that it makes them feel better about themselves is the point that this speaker had. Number two, and this isn't something I was so aware of, but I think it makes a lot of sense, is that in Europe, the idea is avoid war at all costs. That's a great perspective. World War I, World War II. Israel doesn't see war as something to avoid. I think we'd prefer not to have it, but we've also accepted that it is part of having a Jewish country in the neighborhood where we are, that war is going to be to some degree inevitable. It's why we draft our 18-year-olds a few weeks after they graduate high school. It's why we have military reserve service. But for Europe, war in their mind is something to be avoided at all costs. And the point that this, sorry, the point that this speaker made is that there's only one thing worse than no war. Or sorry, the point the speaker made is that there's only one thing worse than war. And the one thing that's worse than war is losing a war. And Europe doesn't have to contend with that idea of losing a war to Iran or Gaza or the West Bank. For Europe, this is all a drama unfolding somewhere else. So there really is no question here of whether or not there should be a war. For Europe, the answer is clear cut. There shouldn't be a war at all. So number three, the role of Muslim internal influence. And I've talked about this one before, but this speaker really highlighted just how impactful that aspect of European life is, that they are very much swayed by the European politicians who are now Muslim, but also the growing Muslim population in their own country. And even if they don't agree necessarily with the rhetoric of globalizing the Intifada, it's hard for that rhetoric to not rub off on them. So the internal Muslim influence is a big part of what's impacting Europe's support of a Palestinian state as well. The next point that came out of this panel was that this isn't just about Israel. This is about a meta, sort of a macro rejection of Western values and more specifically, American values of conquest, repression, oppression, oppressor versus oppressed. We've talked a while here on the pod about oppressor versus oppressed, but this is part of a more global idea that the American way of doing things is bad. And this speaker pointed out that when you go to a pro-Israel rally in America, people always hold the Israeli flag, but they also hold the American flag. There's this realization that America is good at its heart and necessary. Whereas when you go to anti-Israel protests in America, Australia, Europe, they only carry the Palestinian flag. They are not also carrying the UK flag, the British flag, the Australian flag. They are against their own countries as well. And this is something Europeans don't realize, that the enemy, to some degree, is within. But I think that's a really important point, is that this is a rejection not just of Israel, it's what Israel represents in a very handy way. And finally, social media, just the idea that the algorithm really does favor the Palestinian, the Gazan narrative. Because what does the algorithm favor? Conflict, destruction, anger, extreme points of view. And when you have nuanced content, nuanced narrative and storytelling the way Israel does, we're not going to get as favored. And let's not forget the fact that we're simply outnumbered, 100 to 1, 10,000 to 1 on social media. So that's a big factor as well. But that really brought some clarity to me about this European support for a Palestinian state. I've said all along that it just made no sense to support a Palestinian state when there are still living hostages in Gaza. Now, right now, the living hostages are out, but we still have the bodies of deceased hostages there. To support a Palestinian state before there is a safe, demilitarized Gaza free of Hamas makes absolutely no sense to anyone. So that was point number two. Point number three is there was a lot of talk at this conference about PR. Why does Israeli PR not exist? Why has it been so bad to the extent that there is pro-Israel PR? And I just want to bring a few points forward on this topic. So, number one, very important point here, that we need to stop using their terminology. Right now, our spokespeople, hang on. Right now, our spokespeople still use the terminology of the other side, whether it's occupation or occupied territories or disputed territories or even territories or settlements and settlers. And I must say on this podcast, I've been guilty of using the term settlers in the West Bank. And what this speaker advocated was using the term Israelis to refer to what I've been calling settlers in the West Bank, and to use the term Judea and Samaria when referring to what could otherwise be called the West Bank or disputed territories. The fact of the matter is, Judea and Samaria were a part of Greater Israel for a very long time, millennia, and are a part and should be recognized as a part of Israel now. And what happens to them in the future might change how we refer to them, but we need to stop referring to those who live there as settlers and settlements as if it's encroaching and it's illegal. And you can have your own opinions about exactly what Israel should be doing there, but for our broad speaking in public about Israel, Judea and Samaria is the correct terminology. And in general, that's what Israelis do. We say Yasha, which means Yuda v'Shomron. Uh, we don't say, there really is no term for, the occupied territories. We don't say Ashtachim Kvushim, like that. I've never heard that term come up. Maybe in very far left circles it would. But in general, we need to adopt our vocabulary, not theirs. Same with Hamas. They are terrorists. We should not say militants, combatants, certainly not freedom fighters, although I've never heard anyone in my zone of thought use that term. But we need to really pay attention to the words that we use. Another term is two-state solution. This speaker really advocated not using the term two-state solution. And this person's point was that it implies that it is a solution. And when it's a solution and we don't adopt it, it means that we are purposely going against what would be a solution. There really is no evidence to support the idea that two states would be a solution. If anything, it would lead to more problems for the Jewish state. And so calling it a two-state solution really just plays into the hands of those who are anti-Israel. And I'd never thought about that before. I think it's a great point. And then there was the idea of our spokespersons, like what should they do differently? A big point that this speaker made, who's a journalist in Israel, was that we need to correct, or spokespeople need to correct the interviewer before moving on to the question. So oftentimes couched inside the question will be a fact that is, or a supposed fact that is actually not true. And what this journalist recommended was before answering the question, you need to say, first, I want to correct you when you said da da da, and not allow the interviewers get away with using supposed facts that actually aren't correct. This journalist also pointed out that most of our spokespeople tend to be very angry and to come across as moralizing to the audience and know-it-alls. He called it fact dumping, that we come armed into these interviews with so many facts about what happened in the year 2000 at Camp David and what happened in 1948 and the Yom Kippur War and all these facts, facts, facts. And facts are important, but that our spokespeople tend to come across as know-it-alls who are fact heavy and just throw all these facts at the audience, but who don't have a human side to them. And that in general, we need to be more likable and do a better job of storytelling and a better job of using the right amounts of emotion and tapping into people's emotions and not just the timelines and the facts. And the final point this speaker brought up was that we really need spokespeople of different backgrounds. One of the big accusations against Israel, of course, is that we're colonizers, and having spokespeople who are white, late middle-aged men really doesn't do much to go against the idea that we're colonizers. Forget the fact whether we are or not. I certainly believe we're not. But having Netanyahu as our main spokesman, is there anyone who more embodies the idea of a bully, this sort of late middle-aged or older white gray-haired male? Not that there's anything against gray-haired males, but coming at the audience, it definitely conveys the idea of a colonizer, especially when the whole narrative is oppressed versus oppressors, when the idea is white versus dark-skinned. Having that white guy up there giving our narrative, when the fact is over 50% of Israel is not white. It's Yemenite, it's Persian, it's Mizrahi, North African, French, it is Ethiopian. So one thing we might do is consider having some spokespeople from different backgrounds. How about an Ethiopian woman? That would immediately send a different message to the viewing audience. So A lot of it is just so simple and so oriented in how we tell the story and the visual elements that support our story that we can do pretty much immediately. But I found that pretty insightful as well. My overall takeaway is that the government most likely is not going to make a lot of big changes in terms of PR, but it really is up to us. It really is up to those of us who talk about Israel, who are vocal about Israel, to try to make those changes ourselves. I don't have faith that the government will do it anytime soon. And if they do it, I don't think they would do it all that well. But we're not in a situation that's hopeless. There are ways we can move forward. We just need to really pay attention to our narrative and how we tell the story. We're going to take a quick break and then on to the questions for this week. Welcome back to Inside Israel, episode 106. And now for your questions. This is referring to something that I brought up a couple of weeks ago. Karen wrote in. She said, I'm uneasy about the idea of censoring rabbis. How much should rabbis and other Jewish leaders be expected to stick to a certain narrative when it comes to Israel? Look, for me, obviously, the solution is that we wouldn't have to censor at all. For me, the solution is that if you're becoming a rabbi or a cantor or a Jewish professional, it should be in your DNA to support Israel as the Jewish state. Given Jewish history, how could you not? And yet the sad truth is we can no longer take that for granted. We have rabbis who consistently, for the past 2 years, have put on their talit and stood in Grand Central Station and other locations marching against Israel and using their rabbinical title as a way to sort of say even the Jews are against Israel, which I think is horrible. So, look, I'm not for censoring rabbis, but I do think that as part of the interview process, synagogues need to ask their rabbis, their potential clergy, where do you stand on Israel? What are you comfortable talking about from the bima and publicly? And if rabbis cannot say unequivocally that they believe there should be a Jewish state, that they don't always have to agree with it, but that they definitely agree with the idea of it. If they can't say that, I don't think they deserve to be the rabbi of your shul. What does it mean to be a rabbi if you can't stand up for Israel on its most basic right to exist? And what does it mean to be a rabbi if you can't stand up for Israel in public? There's also that big difference between what you say within the confines of your congregation and what you say publicly outside of the building. This is coming up right now with Mamdani running for mayor in New York. And how much should rabbis be vocal? A lot of rabbis say that I don't want to get political. And I think in general, I understand that. You don't want to be the one who endorses a candidate because you want to welcome everyone in your community. But I don't see Mamdani as a normal candidate. This is someone who has used the term proudly, globalize the Intifada, and who has made anti-Semitic statements and who clearly hates Israel. It's not political to be against him. It's about the survival and the flourishing of the Jewish people. And I think rabbis have an obligation to speak up against him and other politicians like him. So I'm not for censoring, but shouldn't it be at the core of who you are, if you're going to take a leadership position, that you support Israel? Here's a comment. We'll leave this one unnamed. Joel, please tell your fellow Israelis that to give Trump a peace prize is something they will live to regret. The damage he continues to inflict on this country, the US, and the entire world is greater than any hostage release. Look, I'm in the United States right now, and I'm seeing a little more up closely just what is unfolding here in terms of ICE raids in our own neighborhood here in the Chicago area. Not that this is on the same level, but the number of flights I've had delayed during my tour because of a shortage of FAA air traffic controllers. Look, I know there's chaos here and I'm aware of it. That said, On this podcast, what I'm trying to bring you is the Israeli point of view. Israelis are not thinking about ICE. They are not thinking about a government shutdown. They are thinking, and they have been thinking about one thing: what will bring our hostages home and what will keep Israel safe. I guess you could say that's two things. That is the only lens through which Israel views the American presidency in general, not just Trump, but even when it was Biden or possibly Kamala Harris or whoever was running. Their lens is the Israel lens. They are not thinking about domestic politics in the US. So I'm just trying to bring you that point of view. And you need to understand why Israelis have that point of view. There's no room for nuance. There's no room for sophistication for us. It really is about our survival of our fellow Israelis who are being held hostage and the survival of the country. That is where we're coming from. Brett had a question about my episode on Yom Kippur and how Israeli kids ride bikes on Yom Kippur, and a lot of adults too, because on Yom Kippur nobody drives, and so kids and some adults go on long bike rides. So his question is, are there Israelis who both fast and ride bikes on Yom Kippur? Yeah, the answer is yes, although the ones who go on long bike rides, there's some adult bike riders who look forward to Yom Kippur because at 6 a.m. they're out on the road riding from Haifa to Jerusalem, doing that big, massive bike ride that they never get to do any other day of the year. They are not fasting. The Israelis I know who fast and ride their bikes, they're the ones who most likely are not religious. They're, with maybe secular Israelis. They fast out of tradition and they'll ride bikes with their family or with their kids, but they are not doing a hard biking ride, a hard bike ride themselves. If they're going to do a hardcore ride, they are not going to fast. But a lot of Israelis fast but don't go to synagogue simply because it's in the tradition. It's what my parents and grandparents and great grandparents did. They're going to fast on Yom Kippur, but they're not necessarily going to go to synagogue all day. They might go to synagogue to hear the shofar below at the end. They'll bring their kids so that they can hear it. But the rest of the day, they might ride a scooter or ride the bike with the kids, but not something hardcore. Final question. Grant asks, Joel, what is your opinion of Mamdani? And I've said this before. I think at this point, we need to accept he is the mayor of New York, the new mayor. My opinion is at this point, we can only hope that once you're the actual captain of the ship, it's a lot harder to implement all of these ideas than it is when you're on the campaign trail. Garbage collection is hard. Running schools is hard. Keeping the teachers union happy. Just keeping a city unified and on track. There's a lot of crime in New York. There are a lot of other issues that are much bigger for New Yorkers than Israel. And I do think Israel will fade away. I also don't see him not supplying security to Jewish and Israel-oriented events. I mean, I don't think he wants dead Jews in New York on his watch. What worries me most about Mamdani is just the fact that a guy like that can get elected. I think that's a bellwether. I think that marks a turning point in how Americans feel about Israel. That when someone can say globalize the intifada and it not be held against him, it's not counted as a strike. For me, that's more worrisome than anything that would actually happen while he's mayor. So that is what I think we need to be worried about. That wraps it up for this episode of Inside Israel. Our next live broadcast will be on Sunday, November 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern. So back to the evening time for the next live broadcast. Keep your questions coming in. You can do that at joelchasnoff.com. That's also where you can sign up for the newsletter to get the links to these live broadcasts and the newsletter, Hebrew is Magic. Thanks so much for tuning in today, everyone, and Lehitraot.